that we have hope of reconciliation with you. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So starting next Sunday, we'll be in a new quarter, and that will be the book of Exodus taught here in the auditorium, and that will be by Mike Benson Sr. That will also include Zach McCrae and Jeremy Hitt, so be on the lookout for that. Mike Benson Sr. mentioned that there would be handouts in the back for next week, so you can prepare by grabbing a handout. I'm assuming those are paper handouts and not financial handouts, but you can go to the back and find out for yourself what kind of handouts those are. But this morning we are going to be looking over Genesis 49 and 50, and one of the things I noticed as I was going through this, we're at the end of the quarter. It's usually nice to do some sort of review of the material you've already covered. Genesis 49 and 50 in a lot of ways already have that review kind of built into the text, which we'll see as we go through it this morning. But one of the things I wanted to talk about first, and really just one more reason to use the picture, is Jacob, right? So Jacob, obviously, he's going to die in Genesis 49. But as we've studied this quarter, he has been alive this entire time. Technically, when we started the last quarter, he first appears in Genesis 25, so he's been alive for a good part of the last quarter we had as well. So Jacob has really been someone that we've studied for a while here in this class. And I just wanted to go back to a couple of points that really struck me as I was thinking about Jacob's life. Jacob is very far from perfect. I don't know if anyone wants to name some of the situations that Jacob participated in or did that might not be perfect. Does anybody want to participate in class this early in the morning? Kind of gauging. All right, so, he swindles Esau out of his birthright. He tricks his dad into thinking he's Esau, things like that. He's definitely not perfect. And it's easy when you think back to the patriarchs, when you think to your heroes of faith in the Bible, maybe you remember them as perfect. You kind of forget some of the bad things that they did, but Jacob was not perfect. Jacob also didn't have a perfect family. And I think that that's something else that we can relate to a lot as well. Jacob had sons that did really bad things. He had grandsons that were so evil that God struck them dead. So Jacob did not have a perfect family either. And I think as we look at that, we ourselves can definitely categorize ourselves in those first two bullets as well, that we're not perfect and we don't come from a perfect family either. And then by necessity, we would also associate ourselves with that third bullet, that as we've seen over the past two quarters, Jacob grew his faith over his life. And the faith that he has at the end of his life is not the faith that he started out his life with. And I think that serves as a great reminder for us that as we go through our lives, we have a responsibility to grow our faith in God as we progress from day to day, so that the faith that we start out with is not the faith that we end with. But any thoughts or questions kind of on the broad point of Jacob before we move on into the material? All right, hearing none, we're going to go ahead and get into the text this morning. If you will turn over to Genesis 49, beginning in verse 1, as well, where we will start to read. We're going to break this into sections as we kind of go through and cover each son's blessing. So to set the context for this chapter, the text will do it for us, but essentially Jacob's getting ready to die, and before he dies, he wants to give out some blessings to his sons. And when we think of someone passing or anything like that, oftentimes you would think that the person passing might only have good things to say, right? Well, as we go through each one of these sons, we're going to find out that's not the case. And as we also go through this morning, we'll see that what Jacob is telling his sons is inspired by God, because Jacob has more knowledge about things to come than just some old man who's about to die and thinking about things on his deathbed. He is inspired to say these things. So I want to begin reading in verse 1 and read through verse 4, and we'll talk about what blessing Reuben received. Then Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in the days to come. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power." So just to insert Ethan comments here, if you were to stop right there, that's a great blessing. Like, you're preeminent. That's amazing. But then you get verse 4. "Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch." So this is a verse that we might sometimes forget, but if you were to turn back to Genesis 35:22, in that chapter, Rachel, Jacob's favorite, has just passed. And in Genesis 35:22, we see very briefly that Reuben sleeps with Bilhah, his father's concubine. And it's unclear really from that. It says that he does it, and then it says Israel heard about it. It's unclear how that all happens, right? And we having studied this, have the benefit of hindsight knowing this happened, right? But I kind of wondered as I was going through this, like, did everybody in the room knew this happened? Like, or is this just like a knowledge bomb dropped before Jacob dies? I don't know. But ultimately, this is the reason why Reuben, even though he's firstborn, he's not going to get this blessing. And as we go through this, there's other mentions of Reuben in the book of Genesis, right? We see him at Joseph being sold into captivity, that Reuben was the one that wanted to take him back to his dad. We see in Genesis 42 that Reuben decides he wants to go back and take Benjamin to Egypt to try to get Simeon back as he was being held as collateral, and Jacob didn't want this to happen. So we see mentions of Reuben, but we never really see Reuben, let's say, do the right thing necessarily from what we see here. And the point I wanted to make really before we move on from this is that what we'll see when we get to Judah, right? Because Judah's not perfect either, but God does a good job of showing us that Judah actually repented from what he did. It was not left ambiguous, kind of like with the Reuben situation. Did Reuben ever try to make right with what he did? Did he ever repent? We know that Judah did, and we'll talk about that more when we get there. But any thoughts or comments on Reuben before we move on? All right, seeing no hands, we're going to go to the next slide. Simeon and Levi. And you're going to see this picture on the next 4 slides because this was one of the best pictures I could find to illustrate this really meeting with Jacob before he dies. So we just get done with Reuben. You know, you're expecting blessings. You're probably expecting to have good blessings. Reuben just got a really bad blessing. And you're Simeon and Levi, and maybe you're thinking, well, our blessing surely is going to be better than that. Like, surely we're going to get something good that comes out of this. And we see verses 5 through 7, beginning in verse 5. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel, O my glory. Be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So we come to Simeon and Levi, and we get another, we'll say, bad blessing on Simeon and Levi. What do you think, and I've got a hint on the slide with Genesis 34, but what event do you think might be being referenced with what we see here? That's right, the Dinah incident in Genesis 34. So if you turn over there in Genesis 34, the Dinah incident happens, and then you see Shechem and Hamor actually come to Jacob, come to the brothers, and try to find some way to make Dinah Shechem's wife. And we see that the brothers seemingly take up the negotiations here. Jacob's mysteriously silent, and the brothers say, well, if you're circumcised, we can make something happen here. So Shechem and Hamor go back to their city. They sell the men of the city on this plan. They all become circumcised, and then 3 days later, when they're in the most pain, that's when Simeon and Levi strike and wipe out all the men and take the goods of the city away from the city and back to themselves. And we see these verses at the end of Genesis 34, verses 30 through 31. Jacob confronts them on this, and Jacob's like, hey guys, like now I'm going to be a burden to the eyes of the people. Like, why did you do this? And I would suggest to you in verse 31, we get a very unrepentant answer when the brothers turn around and say, well, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? So Simeon and Levi here, remember, God knows their hearts. God knows, like, if they've actually changed from the events we've read about. But it seems like from these blessings and the consequences of these blessings, that Simeon and Levi, they're not going to get that chief blessing. They're not going to get a good blessing because of what they've already done in the past. Any thoughts or questions on Simeon and Levi before we move on? Yes?
Even though there seems like a curse because they're scattered and basically dissolved among the nation of Israel, Levi, because they stand with Moses in Exodus 32 at the golden calf, their scattering becomes a blessing because as they're scattered throughout the nation, they become a tribe of priests that will be those that lead the people. So even though it's a curse, God can use it as a blessing if they change their behavior.
That's a good point. And just to recap that, I'm trying to do a good job of recapping comments, but basically God can use this curse as a blessing. He does that with Levi in Genesis chapter 32, where they actually stand with Moses and help drive out the idolatry from the camp with the golden calf. So that is what happens with Levi. Yes?
We know how Levi gets scattered among people. Simeon's not as clear how
Gotcha. It's a good point that Simeon gets assimilated into Judah later on. Anyone else?
I like that he points out
Yeah.
the character traits that he doesn't like. He doesn't say first things, he says first these things that we're doing.
That's right.
That's what's causing them to do the actions that God,
And that's a good observation that I hadn't made, that when Jacob's pronouncing these blessings, or in this case definitely seems like curses, he's pointing out these character traits, these actions that they took that really seems to be driving the curse or driving the blessing. Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about Judah. So we wouldn't know what a good blessing looks like until we get to Judah. So let's begin reading in verse 8. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion. And as a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor this ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Binding his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. So I want to call out a couple of main points really from this blessing of Judah. The first one is that Judah is going to rule over the family. We see that very clearly in verse 8, that your father's sons, aka his brothers, shall bow down before you. We'll come back to verse 10 in a minute, but in verse 11 we also see like this blessing of wealth, right? You can tie your donkey, the animal you're riding, to your choice vine, and even though it might, chew at it or pull on it or anything like that, there's nothing to worry because you're so wealthy, that little damage is not going to hurt you. He appears to be a blessing of good looks, right? He has dark eyes and his teeth are whiter than milk. So really, Judah's getting a great blessing here. But if you go back to verse 10, this was something that I really was struck by and wanted to point out. Different translations translate verse 10 a little bit differently, specifically with that phrase, until tribute comes to him. Does anyone else have a different translation that translates that a little bit differently? Until Shiloh comes is a very common one, yes. Does anyone have anything else? And that is similar with I won't say it's my favorite translation, it's the one I use from time to time, the New Living Translation. This idea of someone coming later, and for some reason my phone on my Bible has decided it wants to update, and it does not want to show me what I'm actually looking at. So let me actually get the written word that Steve's a fan of, and we'll go ahead and turn back over to Genesis 49 really quick. Thankfully, this is also the ESV, so that won't be too much of a curveball for me. But this idea of until tribute comes, you scan over that, and you might not see the connection there with until Shiloh comes or until the one that actually owns it comes. What's going on there? Well, if you're a king and you have to pay tribute to someone, if you're a king paying tribute, that means that king is greater than you, right? So it seems like also this idea that the tribute that would be paid is actually the scepter or this ruler's staff that would be paid as tribute. So it's this idea that someone's coming that's greater than Judah, and that's who he would acknowledge and give tribute to. And also in verse 10 we see, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So this promise of someone coming that's greater than Judah in Judah's blessing, that's interesting. I wonder what that could be. Does anyone want to take a guess at what that might be referring to? Christ, that's right. So Jewish friends might interpret that a little bit differently and try to point to like David or someone, but this is clearly a reference to Christ. And I'll tell you, when we get down to verse 18, there is an inescapable reference to Christ down there. But this is really the reason why it's very clear that Jacob, what he's doing here, these blessings he's sharing, it's inspired, right? There's the futuristic aspect that he's able to predict what will happen to them, but also we have references to Christ being made in these blessings to the sons. Now, another point I wanted to make about Judah as we think about this is, was Judah perfect? Like, did Judah have some issues? Yes. So you have the whole Judah and Tamar incident in Genesis 38. In Genesis 37, he's the one that comes up with the idea to sell Joseph into slavery. So Judah's not exactly been a perfect guy his whole life. But we know that God has looked at Judah and judged his heart and judged his family as the one that he wants the Messiah to come through. And I don't think God has really hidden from us why that is, because if you go back to Genesis 43 and Genesis 44, you see how Judah responds to the situation with Benjamin, right? Where Joseph, they don't know it's Joseph, is taking Benjamin and wants to keep Benjamin as, his own personal slave or person. And we see Judah in chapter 44 stepping up and saying, you know what, I made a promise to my dad, take me instead, right? So when he's presented with a similar situation to Joseph several years later, he responds differently. Really, the sign of repentance and a repentant heart is what I would argue here is what sets Judah apart from Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. Any other thoughts or questions on this before we move on? Yes?
So I think it's interesting that we've seen the blessing that the brothers are going to bow down to Judah, which is obviously a connection to Joseph and the dreams.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering if the other brothers, how they would have responded to this. Have they learned their lesson of, we've heard this before, we've seen it's manifest and it's
Yeah.
a thing, or is there still a like jealousy or anger? Like I wonder, of course the text indicates such.
Yeah.
It's an interesting background.
And that's a very good point, and just to recap once again, I say that because I don't want it to be like I'm trying to steal your point or anything, but like I'm recapping a comment that Josh Sanders made in class. So pin that down, people listening. But Judah here makes this point, or the blessing for Judah makes this point that the brothers are going to bow down to him, and there's the obvious comparison with what happened with Joseph in Genesis 37, where he says that about his dreams, and the brothers don't like that, and they're envious. So this question of, did the brothers envy Judah because of this? And in my head, we'll get to this in a little bit, but with like Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, in my head, I just pictured like them wanting to argue with their dad, like almost like Esau did with Isaac. When Jacob steals the best blessing from Isaac, Esau comes in, he's like, well, can't you give me something? Like, give me some blessing that will make up for this. And then Isaac does give him something. I get this picture like of Reuben, Simeon, and Levi trying to do that, but then Jacob just dies, and you can't argue with that, So I find that to be a very interesting picture. I see Maria. Yes.
I think on the flip side of that, what would Judah's reaction have been, knowing what he's done in his life, knowing Joseph's dream about that, for then that to be his blessing and
Yeah.
inheritance? I don't know if that would have come with some guilt, or if that would have come with, hope of repentance and what faithfulness restores. It's interesting. To think
Yeah.
about the other side, hearing that for the first time, he didn't know his dad was going to do that either, so.
That's right. What did Judah expect when he walked into the room, and did Judah expect this? And, definitely too, what did the brothers expect? Like if you've got mad Reuben, Simeon, and Levi standing over there, like how did they take this? I mean, it's all very interesting to consider when you look at this. Anything else? All right, seeing nothing, we are going to move on. So we get a collection of blessings from other brothers as we go through here in verses 13 through 21. We'll scan through and read these really quickly, beginning in verse 13. And I would challenge you as we're reading this, pay specific attention to verses 16 through 18 as we look over this. But Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his borders shall be at Sidon. Issachar is a strong donkey, crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good, and that the land was pleasant. So he bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant at forced labor. Dan shall judge his people, as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels, so that his rider falls backward. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. Raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. And of course, the two brothers that we have not hit yet are Joseph and Benjamin, which we'll cover in the next slide. We've obviously broken in birth order as we go through this as well, so we're following it pretty closely there for a minute, but now we've gone and we're hitting the other sons outside of the birth order. So we see different prophecies made about different sons. The one that really struck me as I was going through this was the one made to Dan. Beginning in verse 16, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. But then in verse 17, Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path. So just stopping there, generally in the Bible, if snakes come up, it's not in a good context. There's maybe like one or two verses where, you can be as wise as a serpent and it's good, but generally snakes are bad. So if I'm Dan and I'm being called a snake, that's not great. But then we see that this viper bites at the horse's heels so that the rider falls backwards. And I guess a good question is, what's going on there? What could that be talking about? A lot of the commentators that I read equate this back to idolatry. Because if you turn over to Judges 17, you get this situation with this man named Micah where he sets up this idol and he hires this Levite to work for him. And then we see in chapter 18 that there's actually members from the tribe of Dan that ultimately end up taking this idol, taking this priest back to the tribe of Dan itself. And that there are other various threads that connect Dan to idolatry that enter into the people and the children of Israel. So that's really the reference that a lot of people have made between the viper being in the path, biting at the horse's heels, and so that the rider falls backwards. Now, why am I going through all of that to explain that? It's really verse 18. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. This word salvation here is really interesting because this is the first time so far that it's been used in the Bible. And the Hebrew word for salvation is actually Yeshua, which should sound very familiar to some of us. That sounds familiar to Joshua, right? And Joshua's Hebrew word, I don't remember what it is exactly. It's close to this, but not exactly the same. But Yeshua is actually also translated as Jesus. So I find it very interesting here that in verse 18, I will wait for your salvation, O Lord, which could also be translated, I will wait for your Jesus, O Lord. So I find that a very interesting prophetical reference kind of snuck in there as we consider the different blessings of these sons. Any thoughts or questions on this before we move on? I see Steve's hand. I see Josh's hand. I'm going to go with Josh first, Steve. Sorry. Yeah. I'm not trying to pick sides. Anyways.
Just drawing the connection between verses 16 and 17, because even when we come to the book of Judges, there's some of these guys that are referred to as judging the people, but they're not like Gideon or Deborah or these others that we think of leaders. No, it's actually their actions are bringing judgment on various aspects of the people. So that would seem to be how Dan is going to fit that category here.
And which judge came from the tribe of Dan is Samson. So that lines up very well with that Dan might be judging his people by the sense of his actions bringing judgment on the people. Steve? Okay, perfect. I will take that. Great. Anybody else? All right, we're moving on. We'll go ahead and talk about Joseph, and we'll talk about Benjamin now. I will also point out, I don't know if you noticed, I did a quick picture swap about 2 slides ago, and I took the Jacob from the bed, and I put in the other Jacob, but it's beside the point. Joseph, beginning in verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful bow by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remains unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will bless you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. One of the main things that struck me here with the blessing of Joseph is when you've read through the blessings of the other brothers up to this point, God has been mentioned a couple of times, but when you actually hit Joseph's blessing, God is mentioned several times in several different ways. And something I thought was interesting about that is when you think back to what we've studied, what we've read about Joseph's life, time and time again, Joseph is the one that gives credit to God for what has happened. You meant this for evil, God meant it for good. I can interpret dreams because God lets me, things like that. So I think it's very interesting that in Joseph's blessing, God is mentioned so many times. But any thoughts or questions on Joseph's blessing before we move on to Benjamin? Oh, Steve. Oh, yes, go.
To me, it's significant that Joseph's blessing, the amount of wordage is greater than Judah's. And he had already been blessed with that he would be a nation of kings. He has the opportunity, as the king
That's a good point. Anything else? Yes.
Yes, sir. It's interesting as you say how Joseph was blessed to be a blessing, and so maybe that's some coffee grinds the winds to us how we are blessed to be a blessing, as you said.
It's a good point that we are blessed to be a blessing, that we are blessed so that we can turn around and bless others. Anyone else? All right, seeing no hands, we're going to talk about Benjamin just for a second because I don't have much for Benjamin. Verse 27, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. What I thought was interesting is in verse 21, we get Naphtali as this doe let loose to bear beautiful fawns. I just have this idea in my head that Naphtali is like, I'm a doe, Benjamin's a wolf, like, can I trade? You know, like wanting to maybe argue the blessings. Obviously he didn't. But if I was Naphtali, I'd rather be called a ravenous wolf than a doe. But any thoughts or questions on anything we've looked at so far because of the blessings before we move on?
Some of the blessings, you can trace it, how that gets played out in the scripture. And Benjamin would seem to again be the closing chapter of Judges, where
Yeah,
because of Benjamin's actions, the tribe of Benjamin's almost decimated.
that's right.
So he may be described as a wolf, but it's gonna come back on him.
That's right. And we will see in the closing chapters of the book of Judges where really this is fulfilled, and Benjamin definitely gets all the other tribes against him because of the stance they take on certain actions. Anyone else? All right, so let's go ahead and move on. I'm just going to go ahead and read verses 28 through 33. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abram bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There he buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There he buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So really the idea that I already mentioned, that each blessing was given that was suitable to him, right, in verse 28, in my mind, it just goes back to the idea of you get what you get and you don't pitch a fit. You don't get upset. Whether or not they wanted to contend these blessings, maybe argue with them a little bit, they're not going to have the opportunity to. God has given each one the blessing that they deserved. We also see that there are specific burial instructions given by Jacob to his sons. We're not going to do it, but if you turn back to Genesis 47, you would see that after Joseph met with Pharaoh, or after Jacob met with Pharaoh, Jacob makes Joseph promise that he's going to bury him back in the land that he came from, not in Egypt. And it's this really awkward pledge because it's like his hands under his thigh, and I don't understand how any of that works, but it's just very, very strange. But that was with Joseph himself. But here at Jacob's death, we see him basically commanding all of his sons that this is what he wants, and this is where he wants to be buried. And that leads us to what we see in verse 29 and also in verse 33, this phrase, gathered to his people. Now, I started preparing for this class about 2 weeks ago, and it was before the sermon from Nathan Ward. But after Wednesday night's sermon about resurrection by Nathan Ward, I felt very vindicated in my thoughts around this. But there's not a lot given to us in the Old Testament about resurrection, about the life to come, right? There's no clear verses that would tell the people from the Old Testament, hey, you're going to live forever in heaven with God when you die if you do what's right. But we do have verses like this that give us glimpses into what they might have been thinking. This is something that David would have definitely read. People that came after Moses that would have read the old law would have definitely seen passages like this and seen the phrasing of that he would be gathered to his people. And you can look at this and you can make the argument like in verse 29 when he says, I'm to be gathered with my people, that, well, maybe that meant he was going to be buried with the people that had come before him. But when you look at verse 33, there's an immediate nature to the action in verse 33 where he draws his feet up into the bed, he breathes his last, and he's then gathered to his people. And as we'll look at in chapter 50, there is a process to get Jacob to actually be buried, right? It takes a very long time. It is not like he was instantaneously buried the same moment and gathered to his people. So I would suggest that this seems to refer to the fact that he was, his spirit was gathered with the spirit of his family. It's not a hill I'm prepared to die on, but it is something that I thought was interesting and worth considering. Any thoughts or questions on any of that before we move on? All right, seeing no hands. We are on my last slide, which involves some reading. So let's go ahead and get started. Beginning in Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. When the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, I cannot read, I'm so sorry. If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I'm about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father. Then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, go up and bury your father as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all his servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the fields at Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abram bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So first, maybe I need glasses, maybe I don't. Who knows? But we see Jacob is buried. We see that Jacob is embalmed, which I thought was a very interesting detail, because when you think back to John 11 with Lazarus being buried in the tomb, he's dead for 2 days. And Jesus tells Mary and Martha to roll away the stone. And they're like, but he's going to stink. We can't do that. Jacob is out of the ground for months. Like, he is taken back to where he needs to go, and it is a very long process. And that's one of the benefits of the embalming process, is you're able to preserve the body and not have to deal with the smell of decay. So I thought that was a very interesting detail to mention, but we see the sons ultimately fulfilling what their father wanted and burying him where he commanded them to bury him. Any thoughts or questions on any of that before we move on? All right, seeing no hands, we're going to move on to the next part, which is the brothers panicking. Now, I'm not going to read this because I don't know if I could, but we're going to talk about what the brothers do here. So they see their father's dead, and they are afraid at this point that Joseph is going to basically take out all of the vengeance that he might have been storing up this whole time against them now that their dad is dead. And they send a messenger to Joseph first, and they basically say, hey, I'm paraphrasing here, but there's like this secret will of Jacob. He didn't tell you this, but he said, don't take this out on your brothers. Don't take the evil out on them. And we see, I believe it's around verse, let me see if I can find it really quick. It's in verse 17 at the very end. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. We actually see Joseph crying because of these words. There's a couple of reasons I thought of for this, but why do you think Joseph would be crying by what his brothers have presented to him? Yes?
He's already shown hospitality and forgiveness when they came to him back in Egypt, and now they're harboring this still fear and worry that he's angry at them. So he just must be so sad, and that they would still be afraid of him
And that was really one of the biggest ones that I came to, is that you have Joseph, who's done nothing wrong really this whole time. And if anybody's done wrong, it's the brothers. And here they are saying, well, don't treat us poorly now. It's like, why don't you trust me? I've done nothing but right by you this whole time. Why aren't you trusting me? And when I saw that, I was reminded some of the life of Jesus, where his own people that surrounded him would not have faith in him. The people that were supposed to believe in him wouldn't have faith in him, and the disappointment that Jesus felt because of that, I thought was just an interesting parallel. But ultimately, we do see Joseph weeping. The brothers come to him and say, behold, we are your servants. And then ultimately, Joseph reiterates what he's reiterated before. You meant this as evil. God meant this as good. I was able to save a lot of people because of what God set up for us. And ultimately, he comforts them and he speaks kindly to them. So their worst fears are not realized. They are taken care of, just as Joseph promised. Any thoughts or questions on that before we move along?
Ethan, the only thing I
Yes.
can say to add to that is sometimes people project their own feelings of what they would do
Yeah.
in that situation. So maybe the brothers, because of their point of view, they would do that if they were Joseph. So
Yeah.
I don't know why they're so fearful.
Definitely that the brothers could be projecting what they would do if they were in that situation onto Joseph, instead of actually looking at how Joseph had behaved up to that point, how he had treated them, and approaching it from that perspective. Ross?
Patience and the compassion that Joseph is exhibiting, because if it were me, like maybe I would have been able to have forgiven them already, and like for me it would just be in the past. But then if they come to me, sending a servant, like they can't even
Yeah.
do it themselves, that might be more irritating to me. Like at that point, it's like, guys, we already solved this, and now you're like trying to grovel again,
Mm-hmm.
and yet he's the one comforting them. It's like they're his older brothers.
Yeah.
He's the one having to comfort them about how they did wrong to him. It's just, he's got a lot of patience.
Yes, Joseph definitely does have a lot of patience. The whole messenger thing, when they should have just talked to him, is a really good point. I will say, and when you said that, it made me think back to some of the events of Jacob's life, where Jacob would send emissaries, like with Esau, for example, when he's meeting him again. He sends gifts first, and then he arranges the family in a certain order. Like maybe they learned that from their dad. Like don't necessarily handle a situation directly. Send someone first. But yeah, if you're Joseph, that's really disappointing that your brothers don't have enough trust in you to just come and talk it out. Anyone else? All right, so the last point I have on here is the fact that Joseph dies. We see in verses 22 through 26 that, I'm going to try to read it. Let's do it. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abram, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Really, the most interesting point that I found looking through this is if you turn over to Hebrews 11:22 and you look at that verse, as we're familiar, Hebrews 11 is the great hall of fame of faith. The event that is actually counted as righteousness to Joseph, the event that is recorded of his faith, are the instructions he provides here in these verses. That he's about to die, that there will be an exodus, that the people will be called out of the land of Egypt, and that he wants them to take his bones up with them. One of the things I thought about as I was looking over this, we know in Exodus 1:8 that at some point there arises a Pharaoh that knows not Joseph, right? But it seems like Joseph very possibly could have done the exact same thing that Jacob did. Jacob, he wanted to be removed immediately from the area, taken back to where he wanted to be, and entombed with his family. Seems like Joseph might have had the ability to do the same thing, but instead Joseph decided to stay behind and actually leave his body and count on the promises of God that ultimately his people would be called up. And what I thought was really interesting about that is, obviously 400 or so years later, the people think to grab Joseph's bones and take them out as they're leaving, right? And that doesn't just happen. Like, that's something that has to be passed along from generation to generation. Hey, we're going to get called out of the land of Egypt. And when that happens, we need to take Joseph's bones with us. So this perpetual reminder, this perpetual example that Joseph leaves, even in his death, of the people, that there would be an exodus and they would be able to leave Egypt. Any thoughts or comments on anything that we've talked about today in the class? Anything at all? All right. Oh, Ross.
So here in 24, I don't know if this is like the first time, but he says, like he's talking about God, he says that he promised an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And it's interesting, like that's kind of the refrain that we get moving forward, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
Joseph isn't including like himself here, or Judah, or somebody else like that, but like we now have that kind of those three
Yeah. It's a good point. Anyone else? All right, hearing nothing, there will be handouts on the back for next week's class. I'm pretty sure they're paper handouts, like I said. And thank you guys very much for your attention this morning.